Hello and welcome to our conference, Rubens, The Great Landscapes. I'm Lucy Davis, Curator of Flemish and British Paintings at the Wallace Collection. We're delighted to have you here. And now let's hear a welcome message from our director, Dr. Xavier Bray. Over to you, Xavier.
Thank you so much, Lucy. A very warm welcome from the Wallace Collection, where the current meteorological conditions are sunny with a few rainy patches. I know this is going to be a major debate of the weather conditions in Rubens's paintings, but I'm hoping that by the end of the afternoon, we shall be seeing a rainbow outside our windows. As you all know, this is our second digital conference after a Velázquez conference we had earlier in the year. Only very fitting that Rubens should come next. They both met each other in 1629 in Madrid. The conference is to accompany the very, very special exhibition that is waiting for the public, which will be opening on the 3rd of June. Sadly, it was postponed because of the current situation where we are all in due to the pandemic, but we're very much looking forward to welcoming the public and everybody else to the exhibition from the 3rd of June onwards. This reunion of two great masterpieces, two great landscapes, has been a dream for many, I know, particularly for those who were fortunate enough to see the great exhibition at the National Gallery in the 1990s. And for us, it's been a great achievement, and I have to really thank a very big thank you to the National Gallery for making this possible. Both museums were dreaming to one day bring back the Titian Poésie paintings, painted specifically for Philip II. We were able to make a very special loan to the National Gallery, and in return, we were able to complete the dream of seeing the two Rubens landscapes together. One advantage of the pandemic is that we've had a bit more time to plan this unification of two paintings, and that has led to the conservation of het steen, which has come out absolutely beautiful as the varnishes were removed to reveal this very colorful painting. And also new frames, specially designed frames to go with the paintings were conceived. And again, this was very much thanks to the National Gallery for being able to do that. So when you do come and see the exhibition, you will see the paintings in two very beautifully designed frames and two perfectly preserved paintings facing each other and talking to each other quite literally. I think what I'd like to do just very briefly is say the big thank yous as well to the Monument Trust for supporting the conference. A special thank you also to Visit Flanders for supporting the exhibition. Another very special thank you to Marilyn and Lawrence Friedland, who sponsored the publication of Lucy Davis's fantastic catalogue, which you can buy online. Don't go to Amazon, but go to the Wallace Collection shop and you will have a hand-delivered catalogue. But it's a fantastic book and with the most up-to-date research on the two pictures. And also a very big thank you to James and Claire Kirkman, who very kindly supported the cost for the two new frames on the pictures. And Lucy Davis, who's been fantastic in not only organizing this conference, but seeing this project through to the very end. She's been very patient. And I think, as you will all see in a minute, it's been worth waiting for this great historic moment. So thank you very much. I hope you really enjoy this fantastic conference, and see you at the end of it, which will be tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier. This is, as far as I'm aware, the first conference to focus on Rubens's landscapes. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Elizabeth McGrath, Professor Niels Buttner, and Dr. Galinda Gruber, who have generously given their time, support, and insights, which were of the greatest assistance to me in preparing this conference. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Wallace Collection, particularly Suzanne Higgett, with whom I've shared many ideas about it from the outset. I am deeply indebted to Felix Zorzo, Curatorial Assistant for Decorative Arts, for all his help and support in organising the event, and would like to thank our learning team, particularly Andrew Nelson and Oliver Jones as well. I'm delighted that a selection of these papers will be published in a special edition of the journal Oud Holland. So thanks to Niels Buttner, who made this possible. I think it's fair to say that it's one of the first Rubens conferences to be held on a digital platform, so we should consider ourselves pioneers. The great advantage of this is that we have people from all over the world joining us. Lockdown has presented us with some difficult circumstances in which to prepare in terms of technical and academic research, while access to libraries and archives has been very limited. So it's also the first time that many of us will have presented in this format. So a big thank you to our speakers for taking this on. Now to the part where we go through the logistics. As your cameras and mics are turned off, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type questions for our panelists. The chair will be responsible for addressing those to the speakers at the end of each session. The Q&A at the end of the first session is 10 minutes long and involves only the speakers participating in that session. The Q&A at the end of today is 35 minutes and will involve all speakers from the day. So there will be ample opportunity for you to ask a question that there may not have been time for earlier on. We will unfortunately have to impose time limits very strictly in order to keep to schedule. You'll all have received the programme, but just a quick recap that this is a 2-day event, with the first day focusing on Rubens's creative process. Tomorrow's papers will focus in the morning on Rubens's inspiration and legacy, then in the afternoon on the provenance of Het Steen and the rainbow landscape. We're now going to watch a short tour of the exhibition as it is being installed. Thank you.
Hello and welcome virtually to the Wallace collection. I'm Lucy Davis, Curator of Flemish and British paintings, and as you can see, we're preparing to reopen our museum after lockdown. A lot of work has been going on behind the scenes to make it look as beautiful as possible for when our visitors can return. Our first exhibition on reopening will be Rubens Reuniting the Great Landscapes, which will bring together Rubens's masterpieces of landscape painting for the first time in over 200 years. They are, of course, a view of Het Steen in the early morning, an unprecedented loan from the National Gallery, and the rainbow landscape, which belongs to the Wallace collection. We're very excited that this historic reunion can finally take place. As we're installing the exhibition as I speak, I'd like to give you an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour. So here we are outside the entrance to our exhibition galleries. As you can see, this is still very much a work in progress. We have yet to dress the walls outside and in with interpretive materials, which will include details from the paintings themselves, which will enliven the space and we hope also will make our visitors smile. In this first gallery, we will show a 12-minute documentary film, which we made with street films, especially for the exhibition. This will bring the visitor right into the world of Rubens's landscapes and the real place that inspired them, that is, his beloved estate, Het Steen, where he spent his summers. It includes beautiful new footage of the estate of Het Steen, which was recently acquired by Visit Flanders, who have also sponsored the exhibition. We filmed last year during the restrictions of lockdown, which made it quite a challenge to organise, as you can imagine. The film also tells the story of the two paintings, from their creation until their separation in London. In this first gallery, we will set the scene for our encounter with the two paintings. The interpretive text will introduce Rubens and his remarkable career as a court painter and as a diplomat, and most importantly, his decision to return home, to marry again, and to live a quieter and more peaceful life. This image shows him with his family in his Antwerp garden. Our next step will be to discuss in greater detail his purchase of Het Steen 5 years after his marriage. We know from his letters that he intended to spend his summers with his family, in his own words, somewhat in retirement there. He turned in earnest to painting the local countryside, especially his extensive new estate. We will also briefly explore his landscape oeuvre and also the important influence on him of landscape by other painters who were represented in his collection. So here we've kept text to an absolute minimum to enable the visitor to focus entirely on the paintings. And here they are, face to face, two companions together again after a long period of separation. We are immediately impressed by the similarities in style and handling of these autograph works on a monumental scale. We can see how the compositions balance and mirror each other, with detailed foregrounds arranged in a similar triangular structure. They have counterbalancing diagonals formed through the tree trunk and the line of willows in Het Steen, and the track in the rainbow landscape, and figures moving towards us as if out of the painting. It is thought Rubens would have displayed them opposite each other, as we have done here, so that together they create the effect of the cycle of a day at his estate, in summer to early autumn, the very months that he spent there. The sun is in front of the viewer in Het Steen, and behind the viewer in the rainbow landscape. Its position is mirrored when the two paintings are hung in this arrangement. Let's start with the morning scene, revealed after a very successful conservation treatment at the National Gallery, which we will hear about shortly. Now that the discoloured varnish has been removed, we can really appreciate Rubens's depiction of the play of light across the landscape. Here is Rubens's castle, a great source of pride and joy for the artist, the morning light twinkling in the windows. A wagon sets off for market as the sun rises, while a small group, perhaps Rubens and his family, admire the view. The hunter, poised to shoot partridges, is a familiar figure from Netherlandish engravings, and we follow his sightline into the far horizon. The rainbow landscape offers another view of the estate, at harvest time and in the late afternoon or early evening. A rainbow emerges over a vibrant depiction of the wet ground, in what Constable would describe as the exhilarating return of the sun after the rain. There is also some lovely poetic license in the reflection of the rainbow in the muddy water. The figures walking down the track are surely Rubens's nod to Bruegel's Seasons. We're going to hear more this afternoon about these beautiful matching frames that have been made by Peter Schade at the National Gallery. Despite their size and fragility, these paintings have travelled extensively. They went to Madrid and then Genoa before arriving in London in 1803. Our interpretation in the final room will focus on the last opportunity to permanently reunite the pair, which was the sale of the rainbow landscape in 1856. Sir Charles Eastlake for the National Gallery, which then owned Het Steen, sought to reunite it with its pendant, but was outbid by Richard Seymour Conway, 4th Marquess of Hertford. I look forward to exploring these two great landscapes with you over the next couple of days.
Thank you. In recent years, there have been a lot of developments in our understanding of Rubens's creative process. We're delighted to have two of the leading experts in the field, Dr. Nico van Hout and George Bizacker, start off our discussion with their insights into Rubens's distinctive working methods. We will then turn to focus in greater depth on the landscapes with case studies from Larry Keith on Het Steen, Thomas Bobach and Michaela Straub on the rainbow landscape, and Ina Slama on the stormy landscape. The first two relate to research done in conjunction with this exhibition, and we will also learn more about the making of their beautiful new frames. Now it is my pleasure to invite Bart Cornelis, Curator of Dutch and Flemish Paintings at the National Gallery, to chair this Over to you, Bart.
Thank you, Lucy. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce this first session of this conference in which we are going to concentrate on Rubens's creative process. And the first speaker, as you have already heard, will be Nico van Hout, who will talk about Rubens and the flexibility of creative procedure. Nico has that dual distinction of being both an art historian and a conservator, having studied art history and conservation, first art history at Ghent University and then conservation at the Royal Academy in Antwerp. And he has worked on many conservation projects, including, for example, a major project, the Oranje Zaal in Huis ten Bosch in The Hague in the late 90s. And from 2000 onwards, he's been working at the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp as a curator, and currently is the head of collections there. And of course, his special interest is Rubens, and more specifically Rubens and dead coloring, which was the subject of his thesis at Leuven University in 2005. So with that, I would like to give the screen to Nico.
Thank you, Bart, for introducing me. Dear audience, I'm delighted to give you this introductory talk about Rubens and the flexibility of creative procedure. According to medieval and Renaissance art theory, the size of a work was decided upon before any creative process was started. This seems a most logical way to proceed. However, several paintings of Peter Paul Rubens seem to have been the exceptions to this rule. Technical research carried out on his paintings reveals that he often enlarged compositions during creation. Expansions can be found in Rubens's panels, his canvases, and drawings. His flexibility of procedure and creative liberty are quite unique for the period. Some enlargements were needed to solve miscalculations in size, but these cases are excluded from this talk. The following examples show that enlargements in Rubens's paintings are usually linked with his strive for monumentality. One could say the bigger the better, and his concern to enrich iconography. This freedom of procedure occurred mainly, but not exclusively, in private works painted without strict deadlines. A first example is Rubens's group portrait in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, known as the Four Philosophers. The neo-Stoic humanist Justus Lipsius is sitting in the middle. His favorite pupil, the artist's brother Philip, is shown on the left. The man seen in profile on the right is the lawyer Johannes Roverius, also a former student of Lipsius and the scholar's close friend and executor. In the first version of the painting, Rubens has depicted himself behind his brother on the far left and wearing a hat. His presence in this first version was documented during examination with infrared some 20 years ago. The relevant detail appears on the screen in black and white. In the upper right, we can spot a marble bust. It was believed by the four to represent the philosopher Seneca. In the first state of the painting, this bust was standing on a round pedestal. An inclined, streaky priming, characteristic of Rubens's painting practice, underlies this first stage of the painting. Sometime later, probably after his brother's death in 1611, Rubens decided to change his composition. He enlarged the painting on the left by adding a fifth vertical plank. If one stands in front of the painting, one can see that the leftmost join follows a curiously irregular course. Raking light reveals a considerable difference in level between the added plank and the rest of the panel. On the added piece of wood, Rubens painted himself bareheaded and in a more self-confident pose. The new self-portrait is thinly brushed and shows subtle reddish-pink shadows, whereas the features of the other three men are opaquely rendered and heavily modeled with brown paint. A streaky priming can be found on the expansion too, but this runs vertical, not inclined. Some final touches turned this group portrait into a commemorative piece. The round pedestal was painted out and substituted by the flat plinth on which the bust now directly rests. This alteration enabled the artist to add an afterthought, namely the glass vase containing 4 tulips, 2 full-blown and 2 still in bud, symbolizing the dead and the living. The restyling of the niche did not allow much space for the fragile object, which precariously balances on the edge. The Holy Family with a Parrot at the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp is another composition that grew from a smaller into a bigger picture. It all started around 1614, when the artist painted a Virgin and Child by a cradle against a dark background. This was a vertical composition painted on a panel consisting of 5 planks. That first composition is documented in an engraving attributed to Michel Lannes, which is shown here in reverse. The painting apparently remained unsold and was kept in stock for more than a decade. In the second stage, Rubens enlarged the panel with 1 plank on the left and 2 planks on the right, creating an oblong format. The extra planks provided space for the figure of Joseph, for the Virgin's wider gown, and of course, for the parrot and the landscape. Mary was given a low neckline and shorter hair. Rubens also reduced Christ's loincloth. In 1633, Rubens offered the painting as a present to the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke. The second phase was reproduced by Schelte Adamson Bolswert in a print. It was also partly copied in a drawing by Rubens's collaborator Willem Panneels, who left the studio in 1630. Juxtaposing the Lannes and Bolswert prints and the picture in its final state proves to be a most interesting exercise. We get a good idea of the transformation of Christ's loincloth and of Mary's sleeve during Rubens's creative process. 23 years after the artist's death, the painting was transferred to the Antwerp Stock Exchange that was to accommodate the recently founded Antwerp Royal Academy. Probably in function of this new context, the Holy Family with Parrot was enlarged again to its present size. Around 1619, Rubens painted a Fall of the Damned in square format. Dominated by a great pyramidal group of tumbling figures. We notice Saint Michael and his assisting angels on top, and figures of the damned being dragged by devils and demons across the base of the painting. During the painting process, it was decided to turn the panel into a Last Judgment with arched top. eventually forming the so-called small Last Judgment, now in the Alte Pinakothek. Rubens added Christ and the Virgin at the top, with attendant saints on the right and left. The top cannot date much later, as both parts of the painted surface show complete uniformity. The genesis of the miraculous draft of fishes in the National Gallery, London, shows three distinct phases. The first drawing probably made part of a stockpile of drawings after Rubens' compositions. These waited to be engraved by his younger engraver, Lucas Worstermann. At least the subject was mentioned by Rubens in a letter to Sir Dudley Carleton on May 28, 1619. This first version faithfully copies the middle panel of the triptych of the miraculous draft of fishes in Mechelen. The infrared reflectogram shows that the copying process was done in brush and ink, and probably not by Rubens himself. This first drawing was then enlarged for a first time. Various elements in this central composition were corrected and expanded in pen by a much looser hand, probably by the master himself. A third phase must have taken place more than a decade later, in the 1630s. The development of the composition is shown in this infrared reflectogram. A quarrel with Worstermann interrupted Rubens's plan to have some of his compositions engraved. The numerous commissions he had at hand in the 1620s and his work as a diplomat kept the artist from taking up his print project. But in the last decade of his career, Rubens attracted a new generation of engravers, such as Schelte, Adamson, Bolsward. It was precisely in preparation of a Bolsward engraving that Rubens updated the old drawing in oil paint. Thus, he turned the rather cramped composition into a panoramic view of Lake Tiberias. Another important work amongst Rubens' expanded works is the Drunken Silenus in Munich. In this painting, Rubens depicts the ancient myth of Silenus. According to Ovid, Silenus had wandered off from Bacchus' train and had been captured by Phrygian countrymen. Stumbling with age and wine and bound with garlands, he was led to King Midas. The first version of the painting is documented in a studio replica in Kassel, here depicted on the right. In that half-length composition, Rubens focuses on the figure of Silenus. He is exposed to, depending on, and mocked by others, to quote Svetlana Alpers. In this first version of the composition, the drinker in profile in the background is still absent. The second version of the painting is more than double in size. The added space below is filled with a bestial satirist on the ground, suckling her two children. We also notice the stumbling legs of Silenus and his detainers. A manet to the right is involving us in this grotesque spectacle. Finally, Rubens decided to turn the painting into a square format. Some other characters were introduced. An old couple staring at the bestial satirist and the child with the goat on the right side. The extra strip on the left offers space for a flute-playing satyr and a leopard eating grapes. The so-called Peace and War in the National Gallery started as a canvas of rather modest dimensions. The initial composition showed Minerva standing for wisdom, who is driving away Mars, god of war. Two creatures of darkness, amongst of which hunger, are fleeing with him. The naked piece in the middle is nurturing the child Plutus, personifying wealth. Shortly after, Rubens enlarged the canvas with 5 strips into the present format. Technical examination shows that the time lapse between the picture in its first and final state was short enough for the paint not to have dried completely. The added space enabled the artist to unfold a more ambitious iconography in order to seduce royal eyes. Above, we see a Puto holding a caduceus that is about to crown peace with an olive wreath. On the left, a female dancer playing tambourine brings in joy. Another girl is carrying treasures. A group of children, inspired by the children of Rubens's host Cherbier, is gathering the fruits of peace that are presented by a satyr in a cornucopia. And yet another leopard is reaching for grapes. Rubens started his portrait of Hélène Froment in Munich as a portrait in close-up. A workshop copy of this half-length picture is in the Rijksmuseum, cut from all 4 sides. Hélène is wearing a black sleeveless overgown upon a white dress with standing lace collar. Her hair is adorned with a diadem and a spray of orange blossom, symbol of purity and fertility. A string of pearls adorns her neck, and a large jewel hangs on her breast. Subsequently, the artist transformed the intimate portrait of his wife into a full-length picture. The enlarged picture focuses on the white satin dress with gold embroidery and on the mousseline sleeves. Hélène is playing with an ostrich feather. The floor is covered with a priceless oriental carpet, and a scarlet drapery is suspended from 2 columns. We don't know whether Hélène posed in her wedding dress or if she is shown during pregnancy, as Hans Vliet suggested. Anyway, the daughter of a wealthy merchant in tapestries and silk, Hélène seems to feel most comfortable in her sensual world of fabrics. In this introduction, I had the pleasure of telling you more about the fascinating genesis of 7 expanded masterpieces. Of course, this list is incomplete. I also could have talked about the death of Argus in Cologne, the Chateau de Paille, and the landscape with St. George in London, Het Pelsken and the Venus Feast in Vienna, the Shepherd and Shepherdess in Munich, and the 3 Graces in Madrid, to name but a few. Several speakers will address the topic of expansions more in depth. They will be mostly focusing on Rubens's landscapes, the theme of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nico van Hout, for that expose on Rubens expanding his works. We will move on. I should say at this point actually that please do put in your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will get to those after the next talk, which will be by George Bissaka, and he will be talking about the expanding works of Rubens. George Bissaka is the paintings, was still a paintings conservator. He's now the emeritus conservator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and he originally trained at the Ufficio in Florence, and has been employed at the Met since 1983. He has been able to lay his hands on some really stellar works during his career, including Rubens's Three Graces, as the one that Nico already mentioned briefly, the Stormy Landscape in Vienna, but also works such as Van der Weyden, Descent from the Cross in the Prado, the Crucifixion at the Escurial by Rogier van der Weyden, Dürer, Adam and Eve at the Prado, Bruegel, Harvests at the Met itself, or even Caravaggio's David with the Head of Goliath in Vienna, which is quite a roll call. Well, I'd like to welcome him and invite him to take the screen.
Thank you very much, Bart, and welcome to everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be for some of you. Over the course of the last half century, several theories have been advanced to explain the unorthodox constructions found in many panels by Rubens. These panels are composed of a seemingly haphazard arrangement of pieces of varying lengths and widths, sometimes even in opposing grain direction. The practice occurs primarily, although not exclusively, in the uncommissioned works, and this fact is of critical importance to understanding their genesis. The subjects of this group of paintings are primarily landscapes, but also include portraits of family and close acquaintances, and in a few instances, mythological subjects. Uncommissioned, that is, undertaken of his own initiative and for his own enjoyment. And this implies freedom from constraints on format, on composition, or even on subject matter. For a creative genius of Rubens' stature, the traditional process involved in the production of a commissioned work could perhaps be somewhat cumbersome or confining. Normally, an artist begins with some preparatory drawings before proceeding to oil sketches or bozzetti, and then in many cases to a modello or more highly finished small-scale version of the picture before transferring the image onto the final canvas or panel, the dimensions of which were commonly established well in advance. The protracted process cannot help but dampen or sap the energy in some sense from the execution of the definitive picture, since most of the creative challenges have already been resolved before beginning the final version. In these uncommissioned works, Rubens could afford himself the luxury of not having any fixed idea of a final composition, but simply putting down an idea and developing that idea over time, often expanding the composition as ideas occurred to him and precipitating additions to the support as needed. There's very little documentary evidence about this group of paintings, most of which are on wood panel. Commissioned works usually leave a trail of information, including detailed contracts, letters, public references, and even prints of the composition by other artists that aid in accurate dating and can shed light on iconography or compositional details. None of this applies to the uncommissioned works, most of which remained in the artist's possession or in the private collections of relatives or friends, and which were not generally accessible to a wider audience. In these paintings, evidence is at best circumstantial. For example, the autumn landscape with a view of Het Steen at the National Gallery would have a postquem dating of 1636, since Rubens only purchased the property in November of 1635. Otherwise, the lack of documentary sources means that the painting itself becomes the primary, if not exclusive, source of information about its fabrication. Understanding the reasoning behind the complex constructions in these panels requires both an attentive reading of the compositional improvements resulting from the enlargements, as well as some general notions regarding the logical efficiency of high-level woodworking. The Three Graces provides a rare example in that it retains its original surface on the reverse. The picture, generally thought to have been painted around between 1630 and 35, was of course painted for himself and was still in his possession at the time of his death in 1640. While treating the panel at the Prado in 1997 with my colleague José de la Fuente, a cursory examination revealed some crucial details. Please disregard the spring-loaded support strainer that we attached during treatment. Enough of the panel is still visible for our purposes here. Immediately evident is that the panel has been extended at the top. A second prominent feature is this brand mark, established in 1617 as the official brand of the Antwerp Panel Makers Guild, signifying that it had passed quality inspection. The brand occurs here upside down, but if we invert it, you can see that it represents the walled city with 3 towers and 2 hands above, a reference to the myth of the founding of the city. We also know that the Guild did not permit end-grain additions, exactly the type we see across the top of the panel, leading us to conclude at least that the addition must have been made sometime after the panel had passed inspection. Another interesting detail is that the 6 boards that make up the central section are characterized by these mechanically produced parallel saw marks. The marks are certainly original because the charred area from the Antwerp brand extends onto these marks. These 6 central boards are of the highest quality, radially cut Baltic oak, in stark contrast with the 2 outermost boards, which are of inferior quality and crudely hand-sawn. The addition at the top exhibits marks made with the slightly curved blade of a scrub plane in long strokes that extend across several of the short boards at a time and are disposed at a slight downward diagonal. Some of these strokes are truncated below the surface of the main panel. We can confirm from these observations that the upper addition had to be entirely glued together and then planed to desired thickness before being attached to the main panel. Otherwise, the plane strokes could not have been made without passing across onto the main panel. In every case of a lap joint appearing on any of the enlarged panels, the routed track is always planed on the reverse of the existing panel and on the face of the addition, further evidence that a paint film probably already existed on the main panel and needed to be protected, but that the addition had yet to be painted. What is then the significance of these observations? The central section with the brand mark corresponds exactly with the figure group to within a few centimeters on 3 sides. This is typical of Rubens' habit of conceiving an image. His initial conception tends to occupy the entire available space, as evidenced by these preliminary studies of the subject, from Warsaw, from a private collection in London, and from an oil sketch in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. The first edition must be the board on the left. It's the only one that is the same size as the boards in the central section, and it had to be in place before the addition at the top, which, as we've seen, was added as a single piece. Compositionally, the board on the left is the next most important area in the painting, after the figural group, providing a credible landscape in which to situate the figures. While the addition at the top was added next, it's likely that the board on the right was added in the same intervention. This board bridges across the lap joint, both reinforcing the bond and keeping it in plane. In fact, if all 3 additions had been made in the same intervention, sound woodworking principles would have dictated that the left and right-hand additions be symmetrical, with both extending to the full height of the panel and reinforcing the lap joint on both sides. The fact that they are asymmetrical is itself a proof of a temporal interval or sequence. Another reason to suppose that the top and right-hand additions were made in the same intervention is that the same rectangular proportion is then maintained. When the logic employed in the examination of this panel is applied to almost any of the other complex or unorthodox constructions, the sequence becomes immediately apparent. For the panel maker, the overriding concerns are efficiency, symmetry, proportion, and structural stability. But Rubens, for the most part, has little concern for any of these factors. His motivation for the additions is the need to shift the perspective, adjust the position of the horizon line, modify the proximity of the viewer, add descriptive information, or in a few cases, change the subject altogether, as in the cases of the Het Steen or the Vienna stormy landscape, where the defining elements were only added after the final set of additions were put in place. If we look at a few examples from the 1620s, for instance, a shepherd and his flock in a woody landscape, composed of 6 boards, we can see that it began as a simple composition of 2 horizontal boards of similar width, which was then enlarged on all 4 sides. The addition to the end grain were made by half lap joints, as we've seen. However, the vertical boards to the left and right were oriented contrary to the grain of the 4 central boards. This arrangement is strange because while the cross-grain boards are likely to prevent the panel from developing a warp, they also obstruct the expansion and contraction of the central section during fluctuations in relative humidity, very probably causing cracks in the central section over time, depending on the stability of the environmental conditions. Still, Rubens had not yet finished with this composition. In the watering place, he picks up exactly where he left off. He begins the composition with a single board, which almost exactly reproduces the final stage of the shepherd and his flock. He continues to expand the composition on all 4 sides, again, end grain additions by half lap, and then continuous lengths above and below. This is followed by yet another set of enlargements, all in the same grain direction, but this time on 3 sides only, with the half lap occurring here. Still unsatisfied, Rubens has 2 more boards added, but only to the top and right. The National Gallery has determined the narrow strip at the bottom to be a later adjustment. And the outermost board on the right is the only one oriented contrary to the grain of the rest of the panel, as we've seen with the shepherd and his flock. The lap joint extends the full height of the panel, minus the small strip at the bottom. One might have expected a more symmetrical construction, but a plausible explanation can be discerned. In the initial composition, the light source is here. With the first set of additions, Rubens shifts the light source here onto the newly expanded left edge. Satisfied with this placement, he sees no need for further adjustment of the light source or the left edge of the picture. The subsequent 2 enlargements expand only toward the right, constituting a significant perspectival shift. The additions themselves almost mirror the major perspective lines. It's also clear that no element could possibly have been lost from the left side of a hypothetical symmetrical construction because of the existence of the unpainted edge in the upper left. The panel maker may have argued for a more symmetrical construction, but clearly the painter's compositional considerations overrode any such concerns. Rubens then integrates the additions into the existing composition by painting back and forth across the joint lines, often by inserting an animal to distract the viewer. As noted, the practice of adding a board contrary to the grain orientation of the rest of the panel, whether symmetrical or asymmetrical, appears to contravene sound woodworking principles in that it obstructs the expansion and contraction. And yet, despite the fact that it will very likely cause splits over time, the practice persists intermittently throughout the 1620s. Splits certainly did appear within Rubens' lifetime, most prominently in the large stormy landscape with Philemon and Baucis at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. At 2 meters 85 by 1 meter 46 centimeters, It's the largest and probably the last landscape to employ this practice. The horizontally oriented central section has in fact shrunk by more than 1 centimeter across the grain with respect to the vertically oriented outer boards, which do not shrink longitudinally, causing several disfiguring splits. This must have alarmed Rubens and eventually led in the 1630s to the panel makers abandoning the practice. In fact, even in the case of the view of Het Steen, or the rainbow landscape of 1636, the two largest landscapes, each composed of some 20-odd pieces, all elements run in the same grain direction. In the considerably smaller Forest at Dawn with the Deer Hunt of around 1635 in the Metropolitan Museum, composed of 8 boards, the composition began, as you might have guessed, with 2 thin boards, but oriented vertically. Next, the panel was extended at the top and bottom with vertically oriented pieces from the same 2 boards, but reversed in order so as to stagger the joints for a more stable construction. The additions were very probably made by half lap, although I was unable to determine that in the X-ray. In any case, the 6 thin pieces were then backed by 3 vertical boards, doubling the overall thickness while also strengthening the horizontal joints. Finally, 2 more vertical boards of the same double thickness, but without laminations, were added to the left and right. Again, all elements run in the same grain orientation. The process of attaching a reinforcement backing to a thinner section before enlarging with thicker boards seems also to have been the case in the Vienna stormy landscape. Evidence indicated that after the first set of enlargements and before the second, the existing panel was reinforced with a backing covering the entire reverse, doubling the overall thickness to approximately 15 millimeters, making a much more rigid and stable construction. Next, 2 horizontal boards at the top and bottom were added at full double thickness. And finally, the 2 verticals, also full double thickness and without laminations, but contrary to the grain of the rest of the panel. In general, the landscapes are expanded around a central core, but the effect is less a zooming out, as Nico has proposed. Instead, the process consistently adds more close-up detail, effectively situating the viewer closer into the scene rather than seeing it from farther away. The uncommissioned portraits, instead, tend to begin as half or 3/4 length poses, which then become full length. The half-length portrait of Rubens's sons, Albert and Nikolaus, of 1627 in the Liechtenstein collection, was subsequently enlarged, first on the left and right, and then on the bottom, but the bottom pieces are oriented contrary to the grain, and so have caused serious structural problems. By contrast, the portrait of Helene in her bridal gown around 1630 at the Alte Pinakothek also began at 3/4 length and was expanded on the left, right, and bottom to full length. The organization of the 2 panels is similar, but the slightly later portrait of Helene is far more stable because it contains no cross-grain elements. Incidentally, the core panel is constructed of 1 single board, 74 centimeters wide, probably the widest single board in any panel by Rubens. The self-portrait with Helene in France at the Metropolitan Museum began at 3/4 length double portrait, subsequently enlarged on the left, right, and bottom to include France. All elements are oriented vertically, again reinforcing the suggestion that by the 1630s, cross-grain additions were abandoned altogether. Proof that the logic behind the enlargements is governed primarily by the artist's evolving ideas of the composition rather than anything to do with wood movement or construction stability is the fact that similar considerations are also made in paintings on canvas. X-rays revealed that Atalanta and Meleager at the Prado began as a smaller composition that was then enlarged on 3 sides. Similarly, a cursory examination of the Feast of Venus in the galleries at the Kunsthistorisches Museum displays a logic reminiscent of that employed in the enlargements on panel. Looking up at the surface in raking light, the sewn seams become readily apparent. The different ground thickness and resulting crack patterns are clear indications that the core and the additions were not made at the same time. However, the precise interval between various additions to the initial core, whether on panel or on canvas, can be nearly impossible to establish because of the lack of documentary evidence. Cases vary. Sometimes they may be made in corso d'opera, or after a few months, or even after a few years, but scientific analysis is unlikely to sort out the question because of the difficulty of precisely distinguishing and dating identical materials and paint mixtures applied by the same painter after nearly 400 years of natural aging, especially when the painter is likely to have painted back and forth across the additions to better integrate them into the composition, and even modified or corrected other parts of the picture in the process. And keep in mind that Rubens did not tend to varnish paintings when they left the studio, so there would be no isolation layer. The most notable exception on canvas, where precise dates can in fact be established, is the case of the Adoration of the Magi, painted for the City Council of Antwerp in 1609. It was subsequently given to Rodrigo Calderón, a Spanish envoy, in 1612, but after his eventual execution in 1621, the picture passed into the collection of Philip IV. Finally, while on diplomatic mission to Madrid between 1628 and 29, Rubens discovered in the King's collection the picture he had painted 20 years earlier, and he requested permission to enlarge it during his stay. The already large picture, 2 meters 59 by 3 meters 81, was enlarged by more than a meter on 2 sides to 3 meters 55 by 4 meters 93, and even inserting himself into the composition on the right, the only time that Rubens included himself into a picture other than portraiture. In closing, I would like to suggest an avenue of inquiry I've been looking at lately. While it is clear that the head stain and the rainbow landscape were each developed in 3 stages as pendants, I think we can agree to disregard the idea of the pictures originally hanging on the same wall. Framed, they would occupy well over 5 meters. There now seems to be general consensus that the 2 pictures were more likely placed on facing walls inside the entrance hall of the manor, with the head stain on the left and the rainbow on the right, so that the major lines of perspective recede toward the fictive and actual light source at the far end of the room. In 1982, Lisa Vergara pointed out that, especially in these 2 pictures, Rubens likes to establish a pyramidal focus in the center foreground. This compositional device, it seems, may serve a specific function. When seen obliquely, that is, when entering the hall from either end, the cleverly camouflaged perspective then functions in both directions. When entering from the main entrance, the viewer is immediately enveloped by the closest elements in both pictures, looking toward the distant horizon. When entering from the other end with the head stain on the right, the lines converge toward the way back, with the dominant lines heading straight to the sunlit front door of head stain. The secondary perspective lines are subtly camouflaged so as not to be confusing, but become readily apparent when seen obliquely from the opposite direction. All of these observations, of course, are only fragments. The remarkable thing is that after nearly 400 years of scrutiny, we're still coming to terms with the magnitude of Rubens' monumental achievement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for a very interesting talk on how and also why Rubens would have expanded these panels as he did, clearly also learning in the process. or maybe his panel makers were learning in the process, and they certainly must have seen him coming every now and then, and him again trying to do this. That was very interesting. Some questions have come in. I was wondering myself how, perhaps a question to both you, George, and to Nico, how do you account for these? Well, we, especially at the gallery, we've been marveling at the sort of unified final paint layer of a Steen, which we had occasion to look at very closely recently because of its restoration. And this is what's so, well, I mean, difficult to understand in some ways, that you have this very elaborate way of expanding panels and yet still manage to come up with such a unified final product. Now, I mean, of course, Rubens knew how to paint, but it still is how what are your views on this?
Well, Nico, shall I begin that, or?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, I think two factors come into play there. One is the extraordinary skill of the panel makers of Michael Vrindt, and the incredible quality of the radially oak boards, Baltic oak boards. These two things, that this precision is unbelievable. I mean, most people would have difficulty determining exactly where joint lines lie, because they're so precisely executed, and because of that, they last so well over the centuries. That's one factor. And then the second, of course, is that Rubens was totally free not to respect those edges and paint back and forth, even in quite wide swatches, so that it completely obscures any of the joint lines and makes a continuous surface. I think that.
Yeah.
Well,
no, yes, Nico, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes,
well, so of course, in the four philosophers, for instance, in Florence, the join is very uneven. Is really disturbing, even if one sees it from across. And some of the seams in canvases of expanded paintings by Rubens are also quite visible. So maybe also the aging of these canvases and these panels have made the sort of impact worse.
Of course.
The visual impact. Also, the added pieces, very often the optical effect between the lighter underlayers are visible, and the impact may have been less in Rubens's time than right now.
It's clear because there was the increasing transparency of the material over time. Also, another major factor is the interventions that have happened subsequently, because with restraints being put on the reverse, whether they be cradles or battens, that those things could have exacerbated the problems and made joints appear where they wouldn't have otherwise. So.
Yes, and well, one of the questions that has come in is you mentioned, George, about the three graces, that the outer panels were of inferior quality. I mean, seeing you, as you said, there was extraordinary craftsmanship, but how did that come about?
Okay, well, in that's a very curious case. It's very unusual, and one has to speculate on where these additions occurred. I mean, did Rubens have that extraordinary quality of the 6 central boards someplace else, maybe Antwerp, or maybe someplace where the panel makers were very highly skilled, and that additions finally got put on in a secondary area? He's out at Steen, maybe he's getting other panel makers that are not quite at the same level. These things can certainly be factors.
Yes, thank you. Another question is to George. From your view, are there any signs that the core panel of the watering place has been painted by another hand, i.e. Lucas van Uden? This is of course an old idea that's been around. What's your view on that?
Well, I'm just going to defer to Larry Keith on that, because because I haven't been able to have that panel in my hands and examine it so closely or anything, but I'm sure Larry has had a much closer contact with the picture set.
For what it's worth, I myself don't think so. I think it's all Rubens, but there we are. What can be seen of the construction of the enlarged panels on the back? Has Rubens used the same wood species in one painting, or has he mixed types of wood?
I'm not aware of any other wood species being used, and as I say, sometimes it's first of all, Rubens didn't add the pieces. I mean, a lot of people like to suggest that Rubens is such a creative genius that he also enlarged the panels, but he didn't have anything to do with that, really. So I think generally oak and pretty much exclusively Baltic oak was used. I don't know of any other wood except for, I think the little portrait of a man in the Metropolitan Museum in the Linsky collection, I think, is on walnut, but in general it's oak.
Yes. Well, we'll hear a lot more about this process and indeed why and how it was, not just how it's done, but why it was done. I mean, I think it's fair to say Rubens was keen of tinkering with his compositions, which of course is quite interesting in itself, because that tells you a lot about a creative process. Although conversely, you then sometimes wonder, how did he even manage to end up with this very unified not just unified paint layer, but also unified compositions. But I suppose in a creative mind, and especially if these are works that are not commissioned, as you said, there's more scope for that kind of work. So I think we need to, not sure what the time is, we need to move on to the next, well, to the break really, leave everyone some time to digest and perhaps ask more questions. As was said earlier, we can answer more questions later on as well at the end of today. So thank you very much, Nico, and thank you very much, George. And
thank you.
We'll see each other shortly.
What time are we reconvening?
I think we are reconvening at 3:30. Yes, great. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce our chair, Professor Niels Buttner, Professor of Art History at the State Academy of Art and Design, Stuttgart, who will moderate our next session. Over to you, Niels.
Thank you, Lucy. It is a great honor for me to chair this afternoon and to introduce Larry Keith as the first speaker of this session. He is the head of conservation and keeper at the National Gallery, where he has been working since 1991, first as paintings conservator and then as head of conservation since 2010. He studied paintings conservation at the Hamilton Kerr Institute, University of Cambridge, and has worked in the United States and Britain. He has contributed to several articles on painting technique across the range of collection of the gallery's technical bulletin, as well as contributions to exhibition catalogs on Velázquez, Leonardo, Artemisia. And today he will speak to us on the recent restoration of Rubens's head Steen. It's up to you, Larry.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Move on now. Great, thank you. I'm pleased to be able to talk to you today about the recently restored work, which you can see here, and to give you a broad idea of ongoing research about the technique and evolution of the painting. Now, the 15 minutes we have isn't really much time for more than a very broad description, because there's so much of work to show from a large team of colleagues at the gallery from conservation, scientific, photographic, and curatorial departments who have been responsible for leading or helping on structural treatment, imaging, and analyses. And I just want to begin by stressing the collaborative nature of the project and expressing my appreciation and admiration for the work they've done with me. Now, talking about the cleaning of the work, while it's always clear enough the surface was quite yellow, when we opened the panel down for inspection for the loan, we could see clearly just how discolored it was. We'd earmarked the work as a treatment we'd like to do one day after the exhibition. Here's a slide of that first cleaning test. So in a strange sort of way, I'm only talking to you today thanks to the pandemic, weirdly, for it was the delay that it caused that made this treatment possible. The painting entered the collection in the 1820s as part of the original Beaumont bequest, not long after it was separated from the rainbow landscape. Its complex panel construction means the great majority of its conservation history in London concerns one constant theme, as you can see, consolidation of flaking paint, particularly so before we had air conditioning. The most recent previous cleanings took place in 1940 and 1950. And here's an image of the picture in Penryn in Wales in 1940. However discolored the 1950 varnish had been by 2020, it seems clear enough that before 1940, it was even more discolored. Here, an image taken during that cleaning in 1940. However, after the war, not long after the paintings returned to the reopened unair-conditioned gallery, it suffered a major split during an exceptionally cold winter that has become all too famous in British conservation history. The split heard around the world. A rather eccentric solution to the structural problem was initially applied to the panel. I'll just show you the splits here, some details. All the way across. So initially, the idea was to use the reinforced framing as a buttress against which the split panel could be held together in register, unjoined, filled and retouched. While some years later, 1950, a more conventional gluing repair was done. From the point of view of the front, however, it's interesting to note that when it was decided to remove that 1940 restoration during the 1950 structural intervention, it was discovered the whole picture surface had been toned using combinations of warm golden brown or greenish glazes, none of which had been described in the documentation. It's interesting to think about why. It seems a wish to impose or maintain a more golden chromatic unity, I suppose more in keeping with a traditional received idea about old masters in general, or perhaps Rubens in particular. I think there also must have been an effort to compensate for what was thought to be more local fading or loss of color in foliage. But as we can now see, one of the striking features of Het Steen and the rainbow landscape is that brilliant contrast between the warm tones of the foreground landscape and the strong, cool blues of the sky in distant views. And so it's hard to imagine what kind of suppression of Rubens' basic artistic intent this toning layer must have imposed. I think the recent cleaning shows even a moderately discolored, naturally discolored varnish can make a huge difference to the play between white and yellow clouds, lighting effects in the clouds, not to mention that overall chromatic balance and harmony. Here's some images from the recent cleaning. Now, talking a little bit about the structural intervention, which was led by Britta New. The previous repair from 1950 included putting the panel in a tray that was quite shallow and confining. And while the major repair from 1947 remained intact, numerous other old splits and cracks were open. The panel reverse had a pretty haphazard attempt to make a unified response to shifts in relative humidity by spreading a proprietary filler called, I think quite poetically, Steen on the back. Sounds like a heroine from a 19th century novel. Hairline fractures we could see through the filler, and it was removed then to gain access to the exposed oak panel and reveal what was left of the original chalk coating. This gave us better access to the damages and another opportunity to look carefully at the panel construction. Britta made a temporary handling framework to fit the intricate profile, and you can see some of the repairs and joints had failed, were open on the reverse and showing us cracks really on the front of the paint film. And some of these splits were slightly out of plane on the front. And so the handling structure allowed her to apply glue from front and back of the panel, align the splits in position using clamps and props beneath the bridge with the sash clamp necessary, where necessary, for closing pressure. The major split from 1947, the repairs held perfectly well and it was left intact, including buttons glued with the grain. It was decided the best support for Het Steen with its complex construction, many undulations, thinness, and horizontal grain would be a shaped perimeter strainer with several cross battens held to the panel with a series of concentric sprung steel tensioners. This is a methodology developed by George Pisaka to provide adequate support and flexibility of response to changes in environmental conditions. And so the strainer allowed the panel to move and flex safely without stressing the joints. It also has much more structural stability for handling, framing, and display. Now moving back to the front, here's an image of the whole after cleaning before retouching. For all its uneven conservation history, the painting remains, for the most part, in very good state. There are some, of course, discrete losses around the large split, as well as other historic flaking caused by the localized movement of the panel support, most notably in and around the central fallen tree and thicket. The panel suffered from historic overcleaning of areas where Rubens has left his streaky primings relatively exposed, including parts of the sky or around the wagon, but more problematically along the bottom edge, an edge that seems to have suffered some damage that warranted a very early major intervention and reconstruction. I'll come back to this diagram, but at this stage, I just want to note the composition as we've seen evolving in distinct stages with oak planks added to the oak composition, core composition. The only strip that isn't oak is the one added across the bottom, which we believe to be poplar. And here you can see also a 3D scan. You can see the filling along that bottom joint is pretty ropey, pretty uneven, although very old, and really not in keeping with the craftsmanship we expect from the Rubens studio. Anyway, the fact also we have gesso ground on the bottom, the rest of course with chalk, the use of pine and mastic, pine resin and mastic in the paint media, and the composition of the priming and pigment mixtures of the bottom strip all point to it being added sometime when the panel was in Italy. That is between, I think, around 1670 and 1800. Here's some images during cleaning. That it must be some sort of repair and not just simply a later extension would seem indicated by the fact that the join with the half lap, also unusually cut into the front, runs through the middle of the hunter's foot, a crop that would seem unthinkable for the original composition, even allowing for a bit of trimming of original. Some of the worst damage of the whole picture occurs just above this replacement piece here from the lower left, which may or may not be related to that historic intervention. Retouching was fairly straightforward, certainly so around the issue of compensating for discrete loss, like the split. The question of level of adjustment for overexposed priming, or the integration of the addition with the original along the bottom, was a bit more demanding, and that's the sort of retouching that we do in consultations, a lot of discussion with Bart and my colleagues to sort of arrive at what seemed a reasonable level of intervention. I think the design and execution of that, we'll call it Italian bottom strip, isn't entirely convincing, yet given its historic resonance and I think the lack of alternative visual sources, it was left in place and integrated with Rubens' work as unobtrusively as possible. We're now showing a bit more of that strip in the new framing arrangement than had been done previously. I'd also like to point out what appears to my eye to be a considerable degree of local color change occurring across the painting. One of the more obvious things is fading of red lakes, liberally applied as accents and splashes of color and in mixtures. And here it's less faded, of course, in the thickly applied darks of the figure you see fishing off the bridge. Here you see it in the landscape at left, on the ground, intended to sort of rhyme with the intensity of what seems to be unfaded inorganic red on the bird. And you can see it's gone this kind of dusky pink on the ground. And you see also a chalky patch on the flank of the horse, which I presume is the loss of glaze, loss of color, setting off the reddish tone of the horse's flank. I think in the distant foliage, we also can see areas that look to have lost color. You can see sort of dusky pink, pale lilac areas, or even rather gray ones, which would have worked and seemed to have been quite strong accents of warm reds and oranges on the right edge of the foliage, emphasizing that strong raking morning sun, which are now hardly there, just ghostly hints of the color that's faded. And you can really, when you look closely at the picture in the middle distance, you see some strange looking kind of grayish foliage on those leading edges. Though ultramarine dominates the sky paint, Rubens did make use of small, perhaps to some degree in his sketching, but seemingly also as an intended kind of duller grayish accent hue. Mixed with white, it seems not to have greatly discolored at all. You see on the left a revision of the contour of the tree at the upper left, and on the right, a cobalt map in XRF made by Catherine Higgett, just demonstrating cobalt being indicative of smalt, its presence in the sort of final editing stage of the painting of the sky. We also see chalky, rather colorless zones across lower foliage or in the water of the stream and moat, which suggest loss or change of color. And then I have here another XRF map from Catherine with calcium in areas that are suspiciously rather dull in the foliage and where we suspect, again, calcium as a substrate for lakes which have lost some color intensity. I think it's striking to think, though, that even as the painting now has such extraordinary energy, in part as the result of his deft use of very strong local color, these strong accents and bold shifts when new, we would have had even more of those qualities. But still, we can enjoy the range of Rubens handling anew, and the extraordinary control and variation and application, levels of finish, texture, density, thickness, how open most of it is. Some other areas your eye can go across details that are just quite gorgeous to look at. And I think also these very dramatic impasto accents, which I particularly liked on the smooth panel surface. Here's one shot again in raking light. And I only later realized some of those impasto accents were deployed with an unlikely coincidence across some of the joints in the panel. So that impasto I've just shown you, if you see in the central image is a 3D scan made by Rachel Billings along with a panel diagram. You see it sitting right in the dip of the half lap of the end grain join, and I'm sure had a certain role in taking your eye away from that change, minor change in surface texture. So this leads me to the last major topic today, which concerns the complex panel structure and the phased pattern of growth and evolution of the composition. As we've seen, it's a huge topic, how Rubens expanded his composition. So I'm going to do little more than introduce it here and foreshadow more detailed discussions to come. You've seen the diagram of our panel. This is a diagram of the location of joins on the surface. Here with the half laps used when bringing end grain joins. There's of course much more to be said about his joinery. And here a shaded diagram laying out the three distinct phases of composition. And last, a 3D scan of the whole made by Rachel Billinge, which I think provides a very clear sense of the various panel elements coming together. And to me, one of the more fascinating elements here, of course, is that this development seems to have occurred in a kind of parallel fashion with the rainbow landscape, although not exactly identical. And the thing that I'm most interested in, looking at our painting and thinking about, is wondering how finished each discrete phase of the work was before the next expansion took place. Nico, of course, has shown us a very unambiguous example of the Holy Family over the Parrot, where the commemoration of each phase in the engraving speaks to each work being highly finished before being expanded. And it seems that most examples are understood as largely finished paintings being expanded. And the expansion work in landscapes, for example, often includes features from smaller formats being shifted outward or enlarged in scale, although not always, of course. And it certainly seems clear that had Steen evolved in three distinct phases. As we've seen in the discussion of the three graces, similarly here, the support of the first central phase had the Antwerp gild mark on the reverse, here obscured by a coating as well, but still there, suggesting that the support, at least, of the first phase was made as a completed object. I think one of the obvious signs of the expansion occurring in separate phases is the difference in color and composition of the streaky imprimatura, which you can see with the naked eye. Gray in the central panel and two distinct shades of sort of tawny orangey yellow in the outer phases. Infrared, again made by Rachel, shows different pigment compositions and the fact that the priming of the added sections was feathered onto the support of the smaller formats. You can see if you align the infrared with the diagram of the panel, the priming of the smaller format we presumably scrape back to facilitate a more seamless junction. Again, speaking of that level of craft skill George was referring to, and here the same thing with a 3D scan. I think it's worth having a look at the composition in phases as finished objects. Here's composition one, and I think the trees at the left, which haven't moved around at all, work very well as framing elements of the smaller format. The second phase, still not much shifting around. There's a small building identified by Gregory Martin a long time ago, which has been suppressed. But there's no moving of major compositional elements, and as I think George mentioned before, Het Steen itself, sits quite happily and resolutely within the expanded section, and that's its first and final location. And I think also quite tellingly, they're the source of this amazing lighting effect across the whole picture of the sun, at the right edge of the last phase. There is this incredible sweeping, consistent diagonal movement and unified lighting, very convincingly integrated across the whole, without major shifts or repetition of key motifs. The only exception really being the hunter. Here you see him in an XRF map, and now in a more conventional X-ray, you see he was more central, and he was shifted to the left and down slightly. Whether he went on to that third strip or not is a little bit open for question, but he certainly wasn't in the central section and he wasn't enlarged. I think also I find it really interesting to think about the fact that the clouds of the central section keep reserves for lighting effects, which are the result of the placement of the sun at the last stage. So there's a lot of the density and the highlights. There's not any sense of things shifting around in this extraordinary protagonist to the picture, the sun and the clouds themselves. I wonder if the work might have been born as a companion for the more highly worked up, or at least previously finished, core section of the rainbow landscape, evolving alongside it in response to it, with various phases being less finished, taking to something like that dead color phase we see in a work like Henry IV, the Battle of Ypres. And I know, Nico, I'm really curious to see what you have to say about this. And we get a sense of this lively underdrawing sketching phase you can see poking through quite beautifully on the right edge of our finished picture. And I think a slightly lower level of finish would account for what seems to me to be a striking combination of very clear, unambiguous evidence of phased expansion, which what also seems to be an unusual unity and consistency of the spatial organization and execution of the main paint layers. Not so much that you don't see seams, but also that it's so open in many places. But it's not really a binary either or question, it's a question of degree. And so, to my eye, whatever the view is of how finished each section may have been, the process of expansion and evolution that we can see is just another striking example among many of Rubens' supreme creativity and visual intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. We're now very little out of our schedule, but we should move on quickly. The first questions already came in during your presentation, and there may be more. Therefore, I would like to invite everyone to write questions in the Q&A section. We will discuss them afterwards. Now I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Boberg. He is the director of Boberg Conservation, a company which he runs since 2012. He's an internationally recognized specialist for the conservation of canvas and panel paintings. He was commissioned by the Wallace collection to investigate the construction and development of Rubens's rainbow landscape, and he has collaborated in this with Michaela Straub, who has been working for Boberg Conservation since 2019, after she was trained at the Hamilton Institute. Not only because this painting is at the center of this conference, I'm very much looking forward to this lecture. Please, Thomas and Michaela, you have the word.
Hello, and thank you very much. Before we begin, we would like to thank Lucy Davis, who involved us, Nicole Ryder, who organized, and Take Stone Richardson, who carried out and interpreted the infrared reflectography imaging, and National Gallery staff who discussed the findings with us. In this presentation, we hope to demonstrate that the rainbow landscape was created in 3 distinct stages with a fully realized composition at each stage. Here we have the painting with its individual boards that make up the whole. Hatched vertical lines indicate where the end grain additions were added with a half-lap join. Rubens painted the core panel highlighted here as stage 1, followed by an extension that makes up stage 2, and the final painting that we see today at stage 3. And the X-ray is rather difficult to decipher at this size, but it gives us the first clue about the 3-stage construction. I hope you can see somewhat of an outline, but I'm also marking it with a dotted line to highlight it. In infrared, this becomes even more obvious because Rubens applied an imprimatura layer, which gives the center a darker appearance. The wavy lines that we see are the edges of the ground layers that were applied in the later stages, where a different or no imprimatura layer was used. Here I mark these transition areas where stage 2 was joined onto stage 1 in orange, and where the final stage was added to stage 2 in blue. In these transition areas, the edges of the boards were scraped and resurfaced with ground that was applied to the extension and feathered out across the join and over the paint from the previous stage. We can see the evidence for that in this area here at the transition from stage 1 to 2. When placing a soft piece of card level onto stage 1, you can see a little gap from here to here, which increases as it approaches the join, which is marked in white, before we get to stage 2. This slope is where the paint and ground have been scraped off stage 1 in order to join the 2 stages together seamlessly. If you look at the same area in infrared, There's a wavy line of ground. Again here, you can see that in red, reaching across the join in white onto stage 1. The slope, sorry about the weather, the slope that we saw in the previous slide reaches exactly from this red line to the board join. Another example is the area of the shrubs in the foreground, where we not only have evidence of the scraping along the edges, but also an indication that each stage was worked up before the extensions were added. In this area, the painting transitions from stage 2 to stage 3. And the drying craquelure that's visible in stage 2 stops where the ground in red from the final stage comes across the join in white. Stage 2 has already received finishing layers with a higher oil content before a lean layer was applied over the top, either from Rubens changing his mind or in fact from working across from stage 3 to stage 2, which causes these cracks to appear. This indicates that the level of painting in each stage is advanced before the extensions were added. When looking in X-ray, particularly in this area, there is no evidence that suggests any paint from stage 2 being covered, which means that depending on the level difference between the panel and the extension, we have areas that were scraped if they were higher than the extension, and other sections that are low where paint has been covered by the ground from the extension. Besides the reworking with lean oil paint, another cause for this drying craquelure is when the paint has dried enough to form a substantial skin, but not fully dried through its core. It's difficult to determine the exact drying time of oil paint because it depends on a number of variables, but generally the rule of thumb is approximately a month to become touch dry, but up to a year before it's considered fully dry. And Rubens himself is well aware of this drying time because he does discuss it in letters to patrons. But this is where I hand over to Tom, who will show you what's involved in enlarging a panel painting.
We've made a reconstruction with 3 boards, doweled to align the face and butt joined before grounding. All of the tools that we've used, the construction methods and the materials would be instantly recognizable to any 17th century panel maker. The copy is made at half scale with the dimensions of stage 1, a size called a 26 stivers. This was commercially available as a standard size as defined in the Petition of Panel Makers to the Guild of St. Luke on the 13th of November 1617. With the panel complete, we require a painting, and one of such importance that great lengths must be gone to in order to preserve as much as possible during its expansion. In the absence of Rubens, we've recruited another master painter whose work is revered by me, my daughter, Livia. Here is the artist and her work. This completed composition is then revisited, presumably preceded by sketches. We have evidence for these in other paintings expanded by Rubens, spoken about as well by Nico and George earlier. And these sketches are likely for the second stage of expansion, but probably not for the third stage of the rainbow landscape where we see the loose underdrawing present. Expanding a panel is not a gentle process, and the painting must be totally stable, a painting that you can manhandle. You can run your hands over, put tools on, plane, and subject to stress. At any stage in the expansion of this painting, it's important to note that it's far easier and more economical to remake the panel at the desired size rather than to embark on a complicated and laborious expansion. We know from original sources that it would be significantly more expensive to expand a panel rather than buying a larger standard size. The only logical reason for expanding a panel like this is to preserve earlier elements of the composition. The difficulty in achieving both continuity of surface level and camber is significant, and the fact that these joins are so difficult to perceive is testament to the panel maker's skill. The ratios of expansion, height and width are kept broadly the same between stage 1 and stage 2 as they are in Het Steen. In order to make an accurate half-lap extension, it's necessary to use the face of the painting as our datum, because the reverse is irregular. The scribed line, visible here in the bottom right, is the line to which the half-lap is cut. At all points, of this process, the painting is being handled, with tools passing over the surface or being placed face down. The paint must be dry in order to do this, imposing a time frame of months or more likely years between the different stages. The half lap is then cut. Again, the painting has to be placed face down in order to do this. All the evidence that would be present if the painting was still in a state of comparative freshness, such as flattened impasto, smudges, smears in the paint that take months to dry by Rubens's own admission, are not present. I'm showing this video to really demonstrate the physicality of what is required. Working with seasoned oak accurately and removing substantial quantities of timber is a heavy-handed process. It necessitates the painting being placed face down. The paint must be dry. With both half laps cut accurately to the datum of the paint film, the boards can then be joined together. The excess timber is trimmed to square the panel, and the transitions between the first and second stages are prepared. In this case, I used a cabinet scraper, a plane, or any other number of tools could be used. And again, the physicality of this work requires the ground and paint to be dry. We have thick impasto in the first and second stages that we know would have taken extended periods to dry. And in order to undertake this work, the painting must be stable enough to be roughly treated. And so by undertaking this reproduction, we start to see the physical manifestation of the effects that we are seeing in the technical imaging. The hard edge of ground is tapered down to meet the board join and the level of the addition. As you can see, this process recreates the exact pattern of transition that is visible between stage 1 and stage 2 of the rainbow landscape. Finally, we see an exact mirror of the physical characteristics in our copy. The first stage has been thinned, tapering down to meet the surface level of the second stage.
In order to disguise these transitions, Rubens reworked the areas along the edges and altered his composition accordingly, which led us to make the illustrations that show the evolution of the image. While the technical imaging is a great help and gives us indications of what is there and its position, in some cases it's difficult to know how long the elements were visible and at what stage they were overpainted. To begin, I'm cutting the painting down to stage 1, and I'm zooming in. I can then take a look at what could have been there, or what could have not possibly been there, and areas of different paint application, which I've highlighted here. An area of interest is the line of trees in the middle, which has very different paint handling along the top half above this red marking here. In the infrared image of the trees, you can also see a completely different absorption of the upper section, indicating that different pigments or a thicker paint application was used. And if you look closely enough, you will also find several other things. One of them, a double rainbow in white, or a repositioned single rainbow. That's remarkable because it means that, unlike Het Steen, our painting has been the rainbow landscape from the very beginning. The cloud on the left in blue and the horizon line in green were positioned here in stage 1 and shifted upward in later stages to suit the larger scale of the painting, which incidentally also unifies the horizon line with Het Steen at the 3rd stage. Going back to the normal light image, we can then remove all the highlighted elements with a little help from Photoshop and insert our rainbow, and we get something like this, but there is more. If we look in X-ray, we can see 2 small figures in the foreground and a tree along the right edge. Here we have the 2 elements a little bit larger, with arrows pointing at the tree on the right and both figures' knees and her head on the left. And I'm just showing you her shoulders and her nose. If you know where to look in the painting, they are actually quite visible to the naked eye. Both of these elements are worked up to a level where Rubens has already assigned color to the figures and added the finishing highlight to her tiny nose and the tree trunk. Thankfully, Rubens reused some of his elements that I copied and inserted into our illustration. And this is what we think stage 1 would have looked like, a fully formed composition in its own right. Continuing, we can enlarge the painting to stage 2, where it's possible that the highlighted elements remain visible, but we removed some of them just to explore how the composition would have looked like without them. Again, we can look along the edges and find elements that can't have been part of the painting at stage 2, and the half-present cow in the foreground is a great example for this, because it is painted across the board join in white and on top of the wavy line of ground in red, coming from stage 3 to stage 2. There's also no reserve visible in stage 2, which means Rubens did not plan this cow to be present before the painting was enlarged to stage 3. In stage 3, we have a sort of a reserve in the form of the background being painted around the cow. Going back to the painting, we can remove all of the highlighted elements, and we're left with something that could have looked like this. But please remember that the figures and the tree from stage 1 may have remained visible at this stage. Zooming out for a final time, we can give the painting its last extension and get back to what we see today. We hope that we've illustrated that Rubens worked up each stage of the rainbow landscape to a high level of finish, which he considered complete before expanding, and showed through our reconstruction that each stage required drying time before it was enlarged, imposing a long time frame on the evolution of the image. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela and Thomas, for your lecture. Our delay increases. Once again, please ask questions in the Q&A section. Our next speaker, whom I have the great pleasure to introduce, is Sina Slama. She works as a painting conservator at Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna since 2002. In addition to her many conservation projects, she has been working on the technical examination of old master paintings, including the Kunsthistorisches Museum Systematic Catalogue, Caravaggio, and the International Caravagism. Recently, she has focused on Flemish painting, especially in Rubens. She was responsible for the conservation and restoration of the painting surface of the stormy landscape with Philemon and Baucis, and I'm particularly excited about her talk because I read her fantastic contribution to the publication of this great project with very great interest and profit. Please, Ina, the digital stage is yours.
Thank you very much for this really kind introduction, Niels. And also many thanks to the organizers for the invitation to share some findings of our recent research with you today. I will briefly talk about the project, the examination methods we used, the astonishing creative process, and how Rubens integrated the enlargements. I will give you an idea of the buildup of paint layers and examples of how he was handling the brush differently over time. This conservation, sorry, something is stuck here. Yeah, sorry. This conservation and research project was possible because of the funding of the Getty Panel Paintings Initiative, and let me say, dedication of Elke Oberthaler and Gelinde Gruber as project leaders, and of all my colleagues from the PPI mentioned on this slide. They really did an incredible job in stabilizing the weakened and damaged painting support. I had the pleasure to restore the painting surface. It was already mentioned today that Rubens painted landscapes for his own pleasure. This means that he was completely free in terms of format and subject as George mentioned before. That's why we actually expected some changes, since very little was known about the construction of the panel support, and actually nothing was known about its creative process. Until the beginning of this project, the stormy landscape considered one of Rubens' earlier landscapes. But due to our new findings, we considered that Rubens' working process had been ongoing for a substantially longer period than previously thought. Taking into account prolonged periods of breaks, the painting process, having started in the 1620s, most likely stretched into the later 30s. The development of the pictorial content is directly correlated to the structural expansion of the panel, like Steen and the rainbow landscape. My colleague Gerlinde Gruber will further discuss this particular topic and sources of inspiration in her talk tomorrow afternoon. In the course of conservation, the general focus involved a more comprehensive approach. Therefore, various high-resolution photographs and varying imaging techniques were taken. In addition, paint cross-sections and others. All in all, 15 different examination methods were applied. The X-radiograph gives us by far the most intriguing information about the complex and subsequently extended construction, which was built around a small landscape. This initial landscape, the core panel, had a size of only 66 to 85 centimeters. But the X-radiograph also revealed the most surprising creative process over time and its phases of development regarding the changes of its composition. Digital image processing was also used to extract the individual stages as best as possible with the actual available technical resources. It was an attempt in order to assist the understanding of the complex composition based on the analysis we made. Now we'll give you an overview of these 4 stages, starting with the core panel. Here you can compare the X-ray to the left and the normal illumination below. On top in the middle, you'll find the same detail of the X-ray marked with white contours. They delineate the areas where lead white was used. The color image below shows this attempt to visualize these specific changes. From the X-radiograph, we learn that the slightly decentralized mountain topped by a fortress was higher and wider. And like in so many Netherlandish paintings, this mountain was framed by steep mountain slopes on both sides. In the X-ray, you can clearly see this vigorously applied upward sweeping brushwork. Lucas van Uden documented Rubens' landscape in an intermediate state of his composition. You see a detail of his beautiful drawing in the right top corner. It documents that Rubens kept selected parts of his initial composition almost till he finished the painting. For example, the massive mountain, the cascading waterfall, and the coniferous forest to the right. The general composition of this core panel shares clear similarities with another landscape by Rubens. It's unfortunately lost today, but known from an engraving by Schelte Bolsward. In the next few slides, I will show you the various stages of development modified via image processing to the left, and to the right, you will see significant details of the respective phase. So Rubens started probably like this, before he decided to increase the format, reorienting the composition by raising the vanishing point. Rubens expanded the composition by changing the steep mountain slope at the left edge into a broad vista. And to increase the storm, Rubens added waterfalls in the foreground, a cow wedged between 2 tree trunks, and also uprooted trees. At this stage, it is remarkable that there were no figures present, like in Steen. Larry mentioned it before. Later, Rubens had enlarged the panel a second and last time by adding 5 more planks. Only now he introduced figures into the landscape, clearly to heighten the dramatic effect of the scene, but also to use them as chromatic accents, foremost in pinkish orange hues. But definitely the most surprising finding was that Rubens also depicted a group of 3 fleeing riders. They are in scale half the size of Philemon and Baucis. This superimposition should help you locate them. In a last, and for sure most radical step, when the landscape already had its final size, Rubens transformed his landscape with figurative elements into a landscape with a mythological scene. Therefore, he needed to overpaint the figures on horseback with dark gray paint and to replace the storyline with Philemon, Baucis, Jupiter, and Mercury. All that remained of the little riders are uneven spots on the surface, visible in raking light. A series of brush strokes loaded with fluid and thick vermilion and ochre paint should distract from some of these irregularities on the surface. And this is the result of all these revisions. Considering the many individual parts of the panel, one may wonder how Rubens managed to integrate the panel joints. The infrared reflectogram clearly shows the incremental enlargement of the panel structure due to its marked differentiation in density. Unfortunately, we were not as lucky as the colleagues in the National Gallery, who found a note on Rubens on a panel regarding the extension, but we assume that the individual planks used to extend the composition were pre-primed and sanded. This should help to achieve an even surface throughout the painting, but nevertheless, a subsequent layer of gesso was applied over the panel joints, in opposite, obviously, to the rainbow landscape, as we just heard. This layer extends over the extension and the already painted central composition. A cross-section of the blue paint films shows the overlapping paint layers of the earlier composition and the later extension. Rubens hid the slight irregularities in the area of the extensions and relied on distracting the viewer's eye exactly in the same way as the little horse riders. Therefore, he placed waterfalls, trees, figures, birds, clouds, or roots, and brambles to unite the pictorial space. This wonderful detail from the panel joint in the foreground after the second enlargement illustrates Rubens' ingenuity when he retains the difference in transparency between the earlier and the final applications of priming. Talking about preparatory layers, the white chalk ground layers were isolated with a thin, transparent, oil-based film called imprimatura. Its aim was to reduce the excessive absorbency of the porous priming layers. But Rubens, as other Netherlandish painters, just to emphasize Peter Bruegel the Elder, applied this imprimatura with broad brushstrokes and integrated this streaky, transparent, grayish-brownish layer as a mid-tone into his composition. Nico already talked about it today. Fallen or intertwining trees, fences, or brambles or cattle caught Rubens' eye. His drawings are remarkable and were frequently used as key elements in his various landscapes, like in the stormy landscape. Here Rubens applied both, a sketch-like underdrawing and additional washed passages with a small soft brush. Comparison of an infrared and a raking light image of the wedged cow reveal the characteristics and purposes of these applications. The sketch of the cow is clearly smaller than the final image and was laid in with a mix of earth colors and carbon black. For defining the position of the trunk of the tree, Rubens used the same green pigment that he also used for some of the leaves. And in a further elaboration, he enhanced these lines with quite a lot of short, dark brushstrokes. XRF analysis and cross-sections confirmed that Rubens' palette comprised the typical range of pigments obtainable from local dealers in 17th century Flanders. And like in other paintings, he used pre-polymerized oil and mixtures of oil and resin as binding media, specifically linseed and walnut oil and pine resin. Rubens' use of colors plays with contrast of high translucency and more densely applied passages of paint. This way, he gains deep luminosity, like in the detail of the uprooted tree from the first enlargement, where the imprimatur is allowed to shine through. It's absolutely fascinating how the handling of paint changed during the course of the composition's development. In the next 2 slides, I will compare details from the initial and the second state. Not only does the precision and tonality change significantly, but also the tactile quality of the paint. The change from smooth and homogeneous to rough and coarse. Here you can literally dive into Rubens' form crowns, especially into the loosely painted waters on the right. And on this slide, you may enjoy details of small trees painted in different phases, where the variety in color and applications is very distinct. Rubens models the paint, either wet in wet with a soft brush, like in the blue paint of the rushing waters during the first enlargements, or with a bigger bristle brush in combination with less paint. In this detail of the sky after the second enlargement, you can see the viscosity of the paint within the stroke and the pressure of the brush. In the last slide on the left, you can see an example of chromatic adjustment by Rubens. He obscured the mountain that obviously seemed too bright. His reworking was made only with a few quickly applied brush strokes with dark green glazings. And lastly, I would like to show you 2 more details that testify to Rubens' final stage of work that I mentioned earlier. They are bright accents in different hues of pinkish orange and light green. These colored accents can be easily distinguished from earlier smoother passages since they're opaque, thickly applied, and extremely coarse-grained. That tin yellow is presumably the pigment which adds structure to the pinkish orange and green paint. He used these colors in a similar way to reflections of light on paths, of water, treetops, and figures. Rubens positioned them with incredible generosity and precision to balance and unify the composition as a whole. Thank you for your attention. And again, many thanks to my colleagues who participated in this project.
Thank you, Ina. And at the end of this afternoon, we can be sure that our time schedule will be exactly respected because we'll see a film. And I have the pleasure to introduce a video on the new frames for Steen and the rainbow landscape. They are the work of Peter Schade. He's the head of the framing department that has worked in the National Gallery, London since 2005. He has created frames for some of the most iconic paintings in his collection, such as the monumental Raising of Lazarus by Sebastiano del Piombo, coinciding with the exhibition Michelangelo and Sebastiano in 2017, or the set of 6 identical frames for Titian's Poesie for the exhibition Titian, Love and Desire and Death in 2019. And here's the film.
My name is Peter Schade. I'm the head of framing at the National Gallery, and I've been asked to make a short film about the framing of the 2 large Rubens landscapes, the National Gallery's Steen and the Wallace Collection's Rainbow Landscape. Both paintings will come together for the first time in over 150 years in a special exhibition at the Wallace Collection, and inspired by the display of the Titian Poesie series at the National Gallery, which were all framed in similar frames, Xavier Bray asked me if we could not do the same for the 2 Rubens landscapes to show that they once belonged together. Like so many projects these days, we start off by looking at screens. I'm very fortunate to be working with Lynn Roberts for these montages. So these are various different ways of looking at the painting, but in the end, we chose this frame, the original of which is in Copenhagen on Jacob Jordan's Susanna and the Elders. Lynn found this frame, and I think it's a very interesting suggestion because it is French in style, but probably Dutch or Danish in manufacture.
where the side size of that is at that height, there where this line is. So that needs to be flush with the edge of the paint. That's where the.
So if we come, so that's about. Right.
And then there's there. Can you come down a little bit more? Yeah. Okay. And then maybe just go back more. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have looked on. But you know, this is what? A third of the total frame or half? In mass?
Less than half.
I want to move the top up.
Yeah, yeah.
And make sure
if you move the top up and leave the stuff at the bottom, it's going to show.
No, and it's just all that addition goes right to the bottom.
I'm not doing it really very well.
Don't say that, I can't, that'll be on there.
Oh God, really? Oh, stop. I don't know how these people do it with social media. It's really strange because I've done more on that one.
The one on the right looks better than the one on the left.
Doesn't
really.
it?
Yeah.
That's because I fiddled about with that one.
Oh.
I've knocked it and made it.
But it just looks slightly brighter and dust. It looks kind of. The one on the right looks more saturated. The one on the left looks sort of dustier on the surface.
This is the one with the curve.
Okay, so that's Wallace. You can still see that the top was slightly different. No?
Yeah.
But also that seems to have a kind of greenish, whitish dust that makes it look flatter than this one. This one
Hasn't got it.
hasn't got it. It looks actually deeper.
Okay. It does, doesn't it? Okay, well I might just buff that up because that's nothing sort of you can't do with it. These corners should be knocked down a bit.
Lift it in, bottom first. It's quite light. Perfect size. Lighter than you might think. Okay, I'm in. You in?
I'm in.
If you want to have it in the right position, you should put something under it. Yes. Okay.
Okay, so just come like 2 rounds towards me.
We have the National Gallery's painting already fitted into the frame with glass and really ready to go. I will show you from close up what we have done. This is now the third time that we've done this, where we made a reproduction frame and we adapted the inner edge of the frame around the curvature of the painting. And there is quite a pronounced vertical curvature in this panel. And we've then fitted a piece of glass in the middle of the frame, which I think is something that we have pioneered. I've never seen it done anywhere else. It becomes very unnoticeable with glazing. You would normally expect a large shadow, especially a bowed panel like this. The glass would there have to be quite a lot of space between glass and painting for safety, and you would expect a large shadow at the top. And just around the corner, we have the rainbow landscape also now fitted. And now I really can't wait to see both paintings together on the wall of the Wallace collection.
Thank you. This was really impressive. I found it unbelievable how much work goes into a picture frame, which is perhaps at its best when you hardly notice it when appreciating a painting. But now to the questions. After these rich presentations, I think there may be more questions than just entered in the Q&A section so far. While we try to answer the first questions, I would invite all participants to write down further questions in the Q&A section. And I can also start with the first one. And for this, I would share my screen because not only to show you a holiday picture, there was a question on the reflection of the rainbow in the stream at the front of the rainbow landscape. And the person who asked didn't believe that rainbows have reflections, but yes, they have. This is what I wanted to show. But now we can stop this, and there remains the other part of her question, and it's one to Larry Keith. Also, the main arc of the rainbow is a late addition. Is this an observation or just a personal touch? Did Rubens only invent, or?
Well, of course, I wasn't closely involved with the rainbow more than had Steen, but I do think that he can't resist, a kind of exaggeration and making things more than they are in nature, brighter, more movement, more kind of emphatic. So it's not reportage for sure, not just meteorology. So I mean, from that point of view, yeah, I think that's probably right.
Thank you. Another question, this to Thomas and Michaela, has Dandro, or also to Larry, has Dandro been done on the panels to determine the age and origin of the wood used?
So on our panel, sorry, Larry, on the rainbow landscape, we haven't had the chance to do that. Unfortunately, probably also because, as you know, the individual pieces are joined together, so we don't actually see the end grain of all the different stages. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. No? So over to Larry.
To say that no, we haven't done dendrochronology on ours either. I mean, we have such firm ideas about the dating of the painting itself, as George described it. It's quite complex. You wouldn't be able to get much from, only a few of the boards anyway. So at this stage, it's one to be done at a later date.
Maybe George on the dating or on the rainbow.
Well, on the dating, I know that in very specific cases, the dating by dendrochronology can establish beyond any doubt at least a post-quem dating or so of a picture. However, there's an enormous caveat there because there are so many averages taken into dendrochronological dating, whereby you could have sapwood rings that can be between 9 and 56 sapwood rings in a single tree trunk. And so you have to take an average of how many sapwings have been excised from a panel, from a single board, and you have to take an estimated guess about the aging in a workshop before it gets used as a panel, into a panel. And these various things complicate the precision of dendrochronology. As dendrochronologists themselves say, all we can say is that the tree was still growing in this last year. That's about all we can say firmly. So you have to be very careful. I know that art historians tend to jump on dendrochronology immediately as if it's going to reveal everything. But workshop practice tells you very different things. A certain workshop could get an enormous stash of material at a very good price and buy enormous quantities. Other times they're pressed to use wood before it was completely dried, etc. And so there's a lot of complication there that
No, I don't jump on dendrochronologists, and I had a discussion with Peter Klein on the Medici cycle because he told me that the earliest felling date could be 1690 for one of the panels for the Medici cycle. And I know that the finished painting reached Paris in 1623. And the sketch must have been done before. And if he says it can't be painted before 1626, I'm a little skeptical. So it's not even definite. One of the questions is also for you, maybe, George. It remains that the panel extensions of Rubens's paintings do not show the Antwerp brand, and that was obligatory after 1617. And that there are cases with additions against the grain of the first phase. Therefore, can one be that sure that there were panel makers doing this job? Also, something for Thomas, or will you start, George?
Well, Rubens also, his status as court painter also exempted him from many of the guild practices, and this is something certainly to consider. Also, so many times something has been eliminated from the back by scraping or so when we're not looking at the original surface. or so. But I don't know of the incidence of an Antwerp panel brand on a cross grain element from a panel. I don't know of one. Someone could maybe give me
just further to that. The actually in the ordinance of 1617, they specifically state that expansions of panels with grain expansions, and indeed using different kinds of timber as part of the construction of a panel for painting, is forbidden.
Yeah,
so,
what I said with the three graces, that we know that they were not permitted to make these extensions. Yeah,
and actually we have the note in 1626. We have the expansion of the high altar by Michael Brent as well.
Yes.
So we have the documentary evidence, complete with the amount of money that he was paid for the expansion, 38 guilders, I think it was, to expand a panel that had already been made through the guild system, which then turned out to be the wrong size, required expansion, and was expanded by Michael Brent and another local artist, I believe, who did the grounding work of the panel.
Right.
Some questions are difficult to answer because also if you use oak panel, you not always have oak from the Baltic. You also have Rubens paintings on oak from Dutch origin or even German origin. And it's all oak, but it's very different timber. Yeah, here's one question, one more for Larry. What would someone looking at the rainbow landscape in the 1750s have seen in terms of varnish and color?
Well, I think you mean Het Steen again, but
it's Steen.
Same thing. Well, that really depends when it was last treated, because often we don't really know what happened, say when it went to Italy and when the last treatment might have happened, whether there was a cleaning associated with that. If you accept the theory that the piece across the bottom was added sometime in Italy, then you might be looking at a varnish that's 60 or 70 years old. That might have looked rather like Het Steen did in 2018. It's very difficult to know when you have to use the chain of documentation, except that history suggests that interventions often take place when pictures change hands. So it's a reasonable bet that something happened when it went to Genoa, and then you would be looking at something rather like the situation a few years ago in London. It's a guess, though.
Thank you. Ina, may I ask you to start your camera? Because I have a very practical question for someone with the museum. It is the question, how will you stop the frames catching dust? Will museum staff go around with old-fashioned dusters?
Okay.
And if you don't have any idea, I ask Nico, huh?
Well, be prepared with a little brush.
Thank you.
And a vacuum cleaner.
I have to say that that's definitely something we do. I mean, it's in rotation. It's the glamour of life in the museum, but absolutely, it's part of the gig.
Thank you. Nico?
Yeah, similar. I mean,
that's life. Okay, there's only one question left, and this is a question which I can use to give the word back to Lucy Davis, because at least I have the pleasure to thank all speakers and those who contribute to the discussion with the questions, and give the digital floor to Lucy. With the questions, will the paintings remain in the new frames after the exhibition?
Well, certainly our painting will stay in its brand new frame, which is not only beautiful, but it's also been designed especially to support these very complex panels. They're very fragile. And so it's perfect new frame. So absolutely, we intend to. And I don't know if any other of the other panelists would like to add anything about the frames.
No further questions.
Well, I was actually just going to. I would love to, if we have time, just to return to a suggestion that Larry made earlier about the relationship between the two paintings, that Het Steen may have been begun or painted after the rainbow landscape as its pendant. And I wondered if we could, as we do have a few more minutes for questions, if we would like to, if I could ask the panelists to discuss this a bit further.
Before we do that, I'd just like to say that I didn't mean sequentially, but kind of in response.
In response, yeah.
That, I guess what struck me, I mean, these are relative concepts. They've all grown and expanded, but we don't have, the rainbow in 3 different locations. We don't have major features like the line of trees in the rainbow landscape expanded to fit a larger format. And we also have lots of reserves around these diagonals that, I know they can be enhanced by extension, but it just feels like there's sort of, relatively speaking, less dense paint across the whole campaign of painting. But it's hard to prove, I think. You have to kind of look at them side by side. But anyway, I just want to make clear that's the point I mean. I think they clearly grew up together, but maybe kind of
together, but in response to is much better put. Yeah, absolutely.
I think the rainbow landscape was leading the dance, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
And there's one more question that we can discuss here also. In most of Nico St. George examples, Rubens expanded from a coherent central composition. In Het Steen and rainbow landscape, however, the central parts seem to be just random slices of landscape. Do you think Rubens actually considered phase 1 in each case to be an independent painting?
Well, simply put, sorry, was this for us or?
Oh, maybe, yeah.
Simply put, yes, we do believe that it stands alone. And actually, George showed some excellent examples of other early landscapes, which were then developed as Rubens continued through his career. And we very much think that these initial landscape paintings are part of that group, which are then expanded upon. We have the standardized panel sizes, complete with the Antwerp guild marks. So we know that these are commercially prepared panels, which are being bought, painted, and then we have, at least in the rainbow landscape, a worked up and very developed image with compositional elements that are then reconsidered at a later date. So
in terms of the paint layers, unfortunately, in the 15 minutes, we couldn't go into too many details, but what we can see around some of these elements that I showed with the figures and the tree is that we do have reserves for them, and he seems to be painting around them in later stages. So these figures would have been there and visible for some time, possibly through stage 2, possibly even visible in stage 3, and then a last minute decision, and that's when he painted them out. But I do think that, at least in our case, in the rainbow landscape, it really does seem very convincing that the painting at its smallest size in stage 1 was a finished composition.
That's interesting. One more question on the brands, because Jürgen Wadum is very far with dating the brands, because we can't do dendrochronology for the initial compositions, but we can date the brands possibly and can find a date. May it be that these initial landscapes were painted before he bought his Het Steen?
Yes.
George?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Also, I think when you consider the 3 stages of those pictures and the fact that the Het Steen, the first enlargement is on 3 sides and it's only on 2 sides in the rainbow landscape, I think there you come to terms with the idea of the adjustment in perspective being made to equilibrate with the other picture. So that it's bringing it into line so that the convergent perspective lines function more credibly. but the fact remains that each of the three stages are the same size. I mean, they're basically the central core, and then the first edition, and then the third. They all correspond to the same size.
Yes, of course, there are more examples of pendants painted by Rubens, not in landscapes, but in mythological scenes and so on. And I think, yeah, that's probably the case, absolutely the case with both landscapes here in London. So, so it's not unique, and it's probably a habit also, and
Oh, we got new questions. Will the paintings remain? No, are there any plans for the paintings to be seen at Steen now that Visit Flanders had bought it? I think all restorers are never will these paintings be transported again. Not in our lifetime.
I'm not aware of any plans.
Yeah.
No, not aware of any.
You could say that there are lots of other possibilities to show these landscapes in multimedia and so on. So I believe in an immersive world.
I did just want to add actually just a thought or a question, I suppose. I know we've seen a lot of examples today of Rubens returning to reworking compositions throughout his career, but I wondered if this period of the late 1630s was a particularly intensive period for this expanding and reworking. We've got the examples of Het Steen, the rainbow landscape, the stormy landscape, of course. The other examples too.
Well, I mean,
if anyone would like to respond to that.
If you think that the majority of the landscapes were produced, I mean, his semi-retirement to Het Steen, in a sense, to dedicate more time to painting primarily landscapes, is already some kind of indication that he just had the leisure time to be able to pursue that.
Not only his landscapes, he had plenty of paintings in his own collection, and he kept on retouching them, so here and there, according to his leisure and according to his pleasure to evolve a composition and to retouch upon. So there's plenty of other pictures that have a much more complex genesis than previous generations of art historians have probably thought about.
Also, just because he had the paintings in his own possession, he continued to scrutinize them, and then it gave him more ideas, and it would lead to.
And he's not a unique artist in that respect. Degas, for instance, did the same, and I mean, if an artist has retouched paintings that he or herself made 20 years earlier, usually they developed another style or wanted to change something. So that's what has happened with Rubens too, I suspect, yeah.
Isn't it also interesting that in recent years, I mean, no one would tend to compare his creative prowess with Rubens, but more and more large-scale format works by Jacob Jordens show similar patterns of enlargement, as pictures go.
Definitely.
Our double portrait is a good example, the work in Copenhagen. So it's a kind of studio practice, it seems. I mean, not necessarily taken to the...
But for instance, Van Dyck didn't, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know of many Van Dyck paintings on canvas or on panel that have been enlarged as Jordans's or Rubens's. So I'm not so sure whether it's really a studio practice. I think with Rubens you can see it, and with Jordans, but then.
10 years ago we didn't think of. I mean, I wasn't aware of the Jordans thing as connecting more and more dots. It'd be interesting to see if the ripples go out a bit further. But I don't think anyone would argue with the same sort of subtlety. But anyway.
There is another example of Jordan's at the Phoebus Foundation with it's on canvas, but it's an expansion. And just moving forward to, this is not the same time, but Victorian painters had many examples of going back to their paintings and retouching colors that have faded. And I'm not aware of expansions, but certainly going back into the work and reworking compositions that they've had and changing small details. So it's not unknown, and artists have done that for a long time.
Do we agree that to our knowledge, this was quite an unprecedented thing to practice with Rubens?
I don't think there is any artist that has done it so consistently.
Yeah, that's,
I mean,
yes.
Maybe there are, you can find earlier examples in Venetian painting of large canvases with seams that are very obvious and that have been enlarged probably, but most of the time I have the impression that those enlargements or these canvases or have been, let's say, have been put together because of the maximum width or length of a piece of canvas, and so that they had to glue together pieces of canvas to enable to have a large canvas. Yeah.
Well, let's separate out the impetus for the enlargements, because in many royal collections or so, canvases may have been enlarged at a later date to make it be the same size as another picture, to have symmetrical hangings on walls in the 17th century, and so that's a very different case than something that is generated in a continuous creative process, as the landscapes are. The thing that I find very strange is the number of landscapes that initiate with a central core that are then enlarged in concentrically. The number of times that it happens, it just makes you wonder why that would be so consistent so many times. It's hard to figure that out, because just as Tom showed what's involved with making those additions, it's an enormous amount of work, and it's something you could understand in isolated cases, but as a consistent practice where you're always ending up with that kind of expansion that includes that more detail, it seems strange.
But you don't have it only in landscapes. I know also allegories or genre paintings where you have the same phenomenon. And it's true, it's late, but it's a practice also in other paintings. Also, I have another question here from the audience.
I just want to say one thing that strikes me that I find so extraordinary about this is that generally, going back to Alberti, the concept of you make a composition cropped in a window in your mind, and that's kind of where you put things, and to be so flexible and to move out and not to think about framing and crop as part of putting things together, which seems to basic core of what composing is really unusual, I think. There are pragmatic reasons to enlarge things, but that's what I find so extraordinary.
Yes, but they're
different.
But these landscapes in the Wallace and the National Gallery landscapes are not the only ones that are so complex. For instance, the two landscapes in the Galleria Palatina in Florence are certainly as complex as those. So
they came from,
and they're also pendants, probably.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, he's very open to this in a way that's not how he sort of imagines compositions in his mind. I think he's very fluid about it.
Sorry?
I was going to say each of the stages, though, has a completeness of composition in itself. I think that is true.
Yeah. The question that we forgot was on who did this. Do we know who would have constructed the inferior enlargement panels? Could they have been made by assistants in Rubens' studio or by even the master himself? I personally do not believe in Rubens doing this.
Certainly not.
I believe the additions are very professionally worked out, and I think he trusted in specialists. And I also think that these specialists were in Antwerp, not at Steen. And I even don't believe that he had a carpenter's workshop in Steen.
I think you're absolutely right. The amount of tools and equipment and specialization, you're looking at a class of people. I mean, we've got panel makers who are making panels, and that is their job. It's a very specialized skill set, and it requires the tools and equipment and training to do it, and the materials. And exactly as you say, we have lots of letters of Rubens describing moving paintings backwards and forwards between Antwerp and Het Steen. We also have him requesting panels to be sent to work on. So there is this flow of paintings backwards and forwards, and that really ties into the idea that this is not something that you just ask the studio lackey to prepare a panel. This is a much more specialized process.
Yeah, for certain. For certain. Tom, by the way, I like your long hair.
You'll be one of the few.
Okay. Yeah, I can't find any further question. And Lucy, I think it's time.
Thank you so much, Nils. So I'd just like to say a really big thank you to our speakers, our chairs, and our audience for a very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. It's just been so interesting to hear more about Rubens's intriguing, extraordinary working method, his creative process. And I'm sure, of course, we will be returning to this subject again tomorrow with our next sessions. So unfortunately, we can't offer you tea and biscuits as we normally would do, but I'm sure you're keen for some refreshments. So I'd like to thank everyone again and say goodbye until tomorrow afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.